Welcome to Get Into the Act. I'm your host, John Berg, with the Sacramento County Office of Education. Get Into the Act is a series of video presentations brought to you by the California Department of Education's Middle and High School Improvement Office. Renowned educators who are passionate about student learning and achievement will share research-based strategies to help middle grades teachers ensure success and close the achievement gap for their students. Each presentation focuses on one or more of the 12 Taking Center Stage Act 2 recommendations. Dr. Kate Kinsella is currently an adjunct faculty member in secondary education at San Francisco State University and provides consultancy nationally to school districts regarding instruction of adolescent English learners. As a teacher-educator, she has maintained active involvement in 4 through 12 classrooms by regularly coaching and co-teaching while also teaching academic literacy skills to high school English learners in San Francisco State University's Step to College program. Dr. Kinsella is co-author of Scholastic's 2006 Read 180 Literacy Intervention Program and is the 2008 author of the companion 4 through 12 ELD curricula to Read 180, the L Book. She is also the author of Pearson's Reading in the Content Areas, Strategies for Reading Success. A former Fulbright lecturer in teaching ESL, Dr. Kinsella has received numerous awards, including the Marcus Foster Memorial Reading Award and in 2005, the California Department of Education's Award of Excellence for her contributions to improving the education of immigrant youth. This is the first session of a 4-part series of videos by Dr. Kate Kinsella. In this video segment, Dr. Kinsella will be focusing on promoting engaged, accountable learning in the classroom.
Hello. Welcome to Get Into the Act. I'm Kate Kinsella. Today is the first session in a 4-part series that I've designed to address some of the key recommendations to support middle grades learners in Taking Center Stage Part 2. The topic that we'll be addressing today is engaged, accountable learning in middle grades classrooms. And to address this topic, I'm going to be drawing from rich, extensive experience in middle grades classrooms, both as a teacher, teaching French and English as a second language, and also as a teacher-educator, working on a weekly basis with in-service and pre-service teachers serving middle grades learners. A great part of my instructional week is actively involved in schools, coaching, doing demonstration lessons, and I'll be referencing this as we go through, and you're going to see me in action in some footage. So let's get started. And first I want to point out that my sessions, all 4 of them, are going to really drill down on 3 key chapters within Taking Center Stage Part 2, and in particular on how we can really provide content that is rigorous and instruction and assessment and intervention that enables all students in mixed ability classrooms, regardless of their academic preparation, to really fully access that curricula. And we're going to be looking at how critical it is, no matter what we're doing, leading a class discussion, guiding students in reading a reading, teaching academic vocabulary, to make what we're doing immediately relevant to those students. So let's take a look first at some of my objectives. And the first is, as you leave this session, I'm hoping that you and your colleagues will reflect together on your current teaching practices, both as individuals and as a team working to serve middle grades learners in the classroom. I'm hoping too that you'll benefit from observing strategies that really maximize student engagement through structured verbal and nonverbal interaction and responses to instruction. And finally, I'm going to be closing the session with making some very practical recommendations on partnering adolescents in every lesson to respond to your instruction, tackling tasks, and responding verbally. So let's get into our content. I have been working for the last 14 years in a partnership with my university called Step to College, working with early adolescents, in particular 9th grade learners, who aspire to be the first person in the family to have access to a college education, and in many cases, to a high school education. I've worked with native speakers of English, children from professional families, as well as children from working poverty. I've worked with many English language learners and many underprepared students, underprepared for grade level coursework, let alone to aspire to the rigors of a college education. But what they have all shared is a desire to learn and a desire to improve their lives. One of the assessments I do early in the term is to ask them to describe for me the characteristics of a classroom learning environment that makes them feel active and engaged and a real part of the classroom culture, and a classroom in which they tend to remain a spectator, observing on the sidelines, waiting for other students to respond to questions. And they tend to have some pretty consistent comments. But I'd like to share with you some comments of one young student, Consuelo, who I'm happy and proud to say is now studying to be an RN, that at the time was a long-term English language learner who'd been redesignated and was in the academic mainstream, long out of ESL services, and not a recent immigrant, a long-term English learner. And some comments from her journal really, I think, are both poignant and articulate. Look at what she has to say. The class where I'm a passive learner is my English class because I can't express what I want. Yes, I do say a little bit, but not how I'd like to. I don't feel like participate because I'm afraid to say something wrong or pronunciate a word badly. I don't like to be wrong, and I think it's better to be quiet than to be wrong. Consuelo's comments echo many of the hundreds of youths I've worked with over the past years. My first concern is not what grade level content standards I'm addressing today, but it is how I'm going to get her to unlearn this more passive response and more intimidated response to instruction. The first thing I need to think about is how can I engage her? How can I engage her and all of her classmates and increase the odds that they're going to respond to my rigorous instruction that I want to deliver? Now let me define what I mean by engagement, because it's a term being tossed about a great deal in the field now. I consider learner engagement meaning to attract and maintain a learner's interest and active involvement in all lesson content and related tasks, with clearly articulated and relevant evidence checks of a productive and behaviorally observable response to instruction. So clearly, engagement does not mean entertainment, although we know with middle grades learners, a levity goes far, and I draw regularly on my undergraduate degree in theater. But when I talk about learner engagement is how can I, Dr. Kate, get these youths to respond to everything I'm doing? Now, I know in my extensive work with middle school youths that many of them are not like Consuelo. Consuelo shows up every day, eager to learn. She's intimidated to ask a question in many of her classes, or at the time I worked with her as a young adolescent, and she's going to wait for someone else to ask for clarification. But I've worked with many disengaged learners and observed many in action over the past years. And they share some common characteristics. Often, besides showing up in class that day, they haven't established any concrete goals for schooling or for this class in particular. They also often view classroom learning as a spectator sport rather than a participatory sport, and don't perceive that they're being held accountable for actively participating in the class session. Some other characteristics include being either actively off task or during critical lesson activities sitting in what I call an upright siesta. When I'm observing classrooms, I'm much more concerned about the students where I'm not clear about what's going on between the ears. The teacher has asked a question, they do not demonstrate verbally or non-verbally that they've registered. The teacher's delivering core content, they're not taking notes. So part of this session is going to be at getting actively disengaged students, students who are actively off task engaged, and students who are just sitting in a state of cognitive floating to really be responding to the instruction. Other students are disengaged who often feel incompetent and insecure, but mask it with bravado and smart aleck remarks. And as with my young friend Consuelo, none of those attributes describe her. But I would say that she, like many of the English learners and struggling readers I've worked with over the past decade, rely on others to seek clarification and assistance and wait for professional participants to respond, intimidated to not have the right answer. So as we consider what is it going to take to motivate students like my young friend and who are passive and reticent, or other students who are just beginning to check out and disengaged, what is it going to take to get every student in the class responding to our rigorous and robust instruction. And we know the first important characteristic of our instruction is relevance. And this is a key consideration in taking center stage part 2. Students need to know that I'm making important contributions and I want to know more about this topic. I'm making vital connections. This is relevant to me somehow. And for many middle school youths, they felt that much of their elementary education was relevant, but now that I'm in middle school and studying much more demanding topics, it doesn't seem as relevant. They also need to have perceptions of importance. They, at middle school age, all their social connections are so paramount that they need to know in the class, I can contribute, and that was Consuelo's issue, and that I also need to. That I need to have my voice heard, and that my teachers and peers are interested in what I have to say. 2 other critical considerations are that they have evidence of increasing competence. And in my active involvement, coaching and counseling in schools, I see that often if teachers are delivering the same instructional model day after day, and that didn't work Monday, it's not going to work Wednesday either. Young learners like Consuelo need to perceive every day that I left this classroom smarter and more skilled than when I entered it. And finally, what is really the most critical characteristic is their perception of a possibility of success. And that today, in this lesson, I can do this. I understand what I need to do, and I feel prepared, and I won't be embarrassed. Now, if we take all this together and look at these characteristics of disengaged or passive or reticent learners, and also look at these key considerations working with young middle grades learners, we have to ask ourselves, well, what are the implications for engaging all learners in mixed ability classrooms, not just teaching the best and leaving the rest, or accessorizing the most gifted in the room? What can I do to actively engage every learner in my room? Well, every day in every lesson phase, we have to strive to structure rigorous, active, and I would add accountable learning contexts, where that increase the odds that every learner feels competent, supported, expected to perform, and up to the task. As we prepare lessons, I work very much in schools where everyone is thinking about what are the essential content standards I need to address, and what materials and activities and media will I utilize to best address these standards. And there's rigorous and robust discussion around what kinds of assessments people will use to productively assess student learning. But 3 questions I don't see being asked are, what language and literacy support must I integrate in my lesson to make sure that all students can access this powerful content? What I also don't see teachers asking is, when and how should I interrupt my instructional delivery to elicit a response? And we're going to be looking at video footage where we're going to be seeing concrete responses to the instruction that have been carefully calibrated and orchestrated by the teacher. And finally, as I enter the classroom working with middle school youths and work with middle school colleagues, I want all of us to be asking, what will be my evidence checks, my concrete observable data that students are responding to my instruction today, whatever that activity, task, or delivery method might be. Now, there are essentially 2 categories of behaviorally observable responses. And as I'm walking into classrooms, first I'm looking at what are the physical or nonverbal responses to instruction I should be seeing right now. Examples of physical or nonverbal responses would be, for example, highlighting supporting details in a text, or thumbs up if you had a similar answer, or write an example in your vocabulary notes, or point to the location of a specific city on your map. Something where I can see that every student physically is responding. In terms of behaviorally observable responses, we also have an orchestration of verbal responses, individual responses, and for example, I might say, using the academic response starter I just provided you, please share with your partner one reason you either support or do not support a citywide ban on plastic bags, vis-a-vis the information we've learned in our article on the damaging aspects of plastic bags for our environment. So, really having a response starter where everyone's inclined to share with a partner. Another type of behaviorally observable response that is verbal would be a choral response, where I want all students responding if I'm teaching vocabulary, repeating the word, or as an example, recently in a lesson on reading comprehension, asking students, after I read aloud each detail in this passage, I'd like you to decide whether the detail supports the main idea or does not support the main idea. And if it directly supports the main idea, I'd like you to wait till I raise my hand and say relevant together. And if it does not support the main idea, wait till I raise my hand and then in unison say irrelevant. So there's a wide array of physical and verbal responses that we might be observing for. We're going to take a look at a lesson segment right now with a teacher, a friend and colleague, Tanya Ward-Singer, working with a reading and ELD class, and with a group of very enthusiastic learners, but many of whom were contagiously passive as we began working with this classroom. And a little bit intimidated about having the right answer at all times. And I want you to observe, note the way she conscientiously structures this lesson to get clearly orchestrated response, both verbal and nonverbal throughout the lesson. So be watching carefully and take note of what are the nonverbal responses she asks for and receives, as well as the verbal responses she orchestrates. Right, here we go. And in this lesson, she's teaching a lesson on multiple meaning words and introducing them to the concept of multiple meaning words before they look at some key academic words that have an additional meaning in the reading selection they're about to tackle.
Let's first look at the word hard. Please point to hard and check to see that your partner found the right word. Hard. Everyone say hard.
Hard.
Good. Before I show you the meanings, I'd like you to think about a meaning you already know for hard. Okay? Something that is hard. I know that one meaning of hard is, and twos, you can go first.
I know one meaning of hard is like something that's more solid, strong.
And I know that something that's hard is steel. It's really hard.
Do you know a meaning for hard? What's one meaning of hard?
I know that one meaning of hard is.
How about your desk? Is this hard? The TV is hard?
Yeah, no, metal.
It's metal. Metal is hard. It's not soft, right? Good. And ask your partner.
I know that one meaning of hard is like metal, and it's hard to break.
It's hard to. I know that one meaning of hard is
It's
when you
hard.
have
A metal
difficult
is
times
hard.
doing
It's
something.
a metal. It's hard. I always say
Like tests. Yeah, like tests or homework.
2, 1, eyes up here. Okay, let's look at the 3 meanings that are listed in the L book and see which of these you talked about with your partner. Please point to number 1. Check to see that your partner's in the right place. Point to 1. Good job. Hard is an adjective or describing word. It means firm and solid. Like this is hard, the overhead. The hard mattress gave me discomfort. Or you might just say, metal, my metal water bottle is hard. Raise your hand if you and your partner talked about this meaning of hard. Okay.
All right, colleagues, let's see if you noticed as many orchestrated responses to instruction as I noticed. First, let's examine the nonverbal responses. Notice how Tanya clearly throughout the lesson was asking them to point to something, turn to a partner, and she began by asking them to point to the word hard in their book. She also asked them to check to see if the partner had found the word hard. She also asked them to point to number 1 and see if your partner is in the right place, because often middle school students can have off-task contagious behavior where half the class is looking, another half of the class is not looking. So she wanted to make sure that everybody was right with her before she proceeded to the next part of that lesson. She also asked students to raise their hand after she gave the meanings of this multiple meaning word, to raise your hand if you and your partner talked about the same meaning of hard. Instead of saying who had this meaning, throwing the question out to the classroom stratosphere and seeing who might elect to respond. She got every single student responding, and as she was coming back to wrap up their partnering tasks, she asked them 3, 2, 1, all eyes up here. So at every moment, students knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing. Now, she used an array of verbal responses as well. Choral responses, asking everyone as she introduced the word to be looking at it and repeating after her. Everyone say hard. In terms, she used some excellent structured partnering as well, giving them a sentence starter that you may have noticed right behind her on an easel. I know that one meaning of hard is, and she modeled that and said, and twos, you can go first. I was very impressed that every single student, from native speakers to English language learners, went into automatic pilot using that academic sentence starter. Every student was accountably responding, and that no one was dithering, looking at what are we supposed to do. This was clearly an instructional routine in the class. So in a very brief amount of time, she efficiently got every single one of the students actively involved. She had clear comprehension checks. Every student was sharing with a partner. Now, before we end this session, I'd like to really unveil some pragmatics of structured partnering, because what Tanya just did is both a science and an art. She didn't just say, hey, turn to anybody. She had clearly orchestrated partners, put some thought into which students were working with which students, and that these students, this was a daily routine, something we do regularly. My teacher regularly interrupts instruction to get us talking to each other, discussing, collaborating, comparing. So let me offer some advice based on extensive experience where the partnerships were not very productive. The first thing I would recommend is that you assign the partners. Students in middle school like subtract, and you may have some of the most deviantly gifted students in the class with some of the most contagiously passive working together. So we want to put a little thought and not just have it be a creative seating arrangement. The first thing I'm going to strongly urge, since many of you work in mixed ability classrooms, including less proficient readers and less proficient English learners, is that you consider level of English proficiency. If you have English learners in your classroom, I would take a careful look at their CELT data to see, is this an intermediate learner? Is this an early advanced learner? I would also look carefully at their literacy, looking at any kind of data you have at your site together, and looking at standardized test data, but look carefully at any writing that they've submitted to you. For me, the first couple weeks of instruction, I want to make sure that I get a few evidence checks of their writing, because their writing tells me a great deal about their command of vocabulary, syntax, and literacy in general. So take a careful look at that. Also consider the subject matter knowledge. You may have a student that doesn't have a highly proficient command of English, but really knows that subject matter, having had a strong educational background before in that content. So consider their subject matter knowledge. In middle school, I'm always going to take into consideration as well social skills. How well can this student easily interact with students with different gender, different experiences, different age, and maturity. And I'm going to look at personality. A student like my young friend Consuelo, when I was initially working with her, not later, but initially, was very reserved. Not shy, but reserved, and a bit fragile. So I wanted to really make sure she was with someone who would be caring and conscientious. I also look carefully at attendance and recommend that you do too. Anyone with a sketchy attendance record, I really don't want to have partnered with one of my most vulnerable students. And I'll have a recommendation if you have students that have sporadic attendance records, how to take that into consideration when assigning partners. And finally, really look at their on-task track record. How well does this student get down to business? And I don't want to have two students that have trouble getting started together. Another critical recommendation with structured partnering is that you integrate structured partnering tasks routinely, not random acts of collaboration. Because if you do this sort of once kicking off your unit, every single time you do it, it is a moderately traumatic experience for a student who's used to just sitting there passively and observing instruction go by. It needs to happen every lesson. When I teach a 50-minute class session, I'm going to have at least 3 times where I have a brief partnering task to check for comprehension, get them discussing with one another, get them applying a newly taught word, and even more in a longer block time. So we need to do it regularly, and it needs to happen across the subject areas, because it's equally difficult for a student to go into one class where they're held highly accountable for responding to instruction, and then they get to basically be in cruise control in the next 2. So we want to integrate structured partnering tasks in every lesson across the curriculum on a daily basis to foster a more collaborative learning environment and to maximize the amount of students who are responding to our instruction at all times, but also to ensure that partnering tasks are actually efficient and effective routines rather than random activities. Some other strong recommendations are that you identify partner roles. In middle school, I find number 1, number 2 the most effective. And you might even want to think, if you have, by just putting some little markers or masking tape on the desks that just say 1 and 2 if you want, or this row's 1, this row's 2, but have it clearly established. I also recommend that a partner not be a life sentence, that they be with the same partner for the entire academic year. Partners need to be changed routinely, but strategically. And I would recommend, say, either at the end of a unit, perhaps at the end of a month. End of a quarter gets a bit too long, but that would be, if you were only going to change 4 times a year, that would be the least that you might want to consider changing. But I would think to do it more strategically, perhaps at the end of a unit. And I would, as a recommendation, avoid partnering your least proficient and most vulnerable students with your most proficient. That really gives some thought. And as a rule of thumb, high can be with mid, mid can be with low, but I would avoid high with low, just because that highly proficient student is often going to take the task hostage and really do the task rather than allowing that other student, having the patience to allow that other student to really be engaged and responding actively and responsibly. Another strong recommendation is to have 2 floaters. Every time I assign new partners, I consider who will be my 2 floaters or pinch hitters, if you will. And what I mean by this is I have 2 students that I can rely on with good social skills. They don't necessarily need to be my most academically proficient, but reasonable social skills in the classroom. So if I have a student who is ill, I can assign one of my floaters to go work with a student who does not have his or her partner. And it should be part of your daily practice that at the beginning of class, students announce to you that their partner is absent. So you can assign one of your floaters to go work with that student. Meanwhile, my additional floater, I'm going to look around the room to see if there's a duo that's a little less than dynamic and assign that floater to go work as a bonus number 2 to move them along. And another strong recommendation is that you assign sentence frames, that you have sentence frames, and my last session is going to deal really strongly on how to structure a verbal response. But when appropriate, to assign academic response frames that help them efficiently produce a competent verbal response, as we saw in our video clip. And as a rule of thumb, I would limit partner interactions to 1 or 2 minutes. If it starts to drag on to a 10-minute task, that's probably not the most efficient use of partners in the classroom. So I'd rather have several brief interactions. We're going to watch one very brief video clip. It just lasts about 30 seconds, and we're going to see the same teacher in action working with the same classroom. And in this clip, she's going to be preparing them for some vocabulary that will be useful as they embark upon a writing assignment. And she's taken everyday overused words that she anticipated these students might be likely to use in their writing assignment and given them more academic words or more precise words that she thought they would recognize, that they would be in their receptive vocabulary. And she's explained the meanings, and she's given them a task where they have to take these new words and try to see where they would fit in some sentences she's provided, and try to analyze the context and to place these new words in those easy, accessible sentences before she has them try to apply them to their writing draft. And I want you to watch again. This is an 8th grade classroom, more mature learners than the last class we saw, but I want you to watch how quickly these students get down to business. This is a mixed ability class with a full range of ability, from gifted to very struggling readers and intermediate English learners. So watch this in action and see how efficiently this partnering takes place.
I'd like you to think about what word would make the most sense in that sentence and point to that word. Point to the word that you think makes the most sense in the sentence. Then partner number 2 is going to start and tell your partner, I think the word blank makes sense in this sentence. Then partner number 1, you'll say, I agree, or I disagree. I think we should write the word blank. So you're going to talk about your choice. When you both agree, you'll write your choice. Okay? Partner number 2, you're going to begin.
I think the word tiny goes here because it makes sense, because it says weather forecast said there was a tiny chance of hurricane.
Well, I don't agree because later it says soon the rain started, and then you said that there was a tiny chance of rain. So I think it's a excellent chance of a hurricane.
Excellent, but that kind of sounds awkward. Excellent chance of hurricane. I think I'm like only tiny here.
All right, colleagues, I hope it's vividly apparent to you after watching these 2 segments from middle grades classrooms, both a 6th grade class for reading intervention and English language development, as well as a mixed ability 8th grade English language arts class, that engaged student learning is not a function of how knowledgeable, caffeinated, or charismatic the teacher is. It's more a function of how intellectually and socially supported and accountable for responding a learner feels on a daily basis in every classroom. And some hallmarks of student engagement that we've witnessed in these video clips are, first, consistent explicit scaffolding of the lesson's conceptual, strategic, and linguistic demands. We also saw Tanya carefully interrupting instruction to elicit concrete, clearly articulated student responses. What you no doubt witnessed too was a balance of student talk and teacher talk. And in their facial expressions, as well as in their confident responses, we saw increased learner competence. Finally, what I saw that was most impressive is that there was 100% learner engagement. That if a task is important enough to assign, if the content is important enough for you to deliver, then it's important enough that every single one of your students is actively processing and responding to that content. In our next sessions, I'll be delivering 3 successive topics that are related to explicit structured learner engagement. In my next session, I'll be tackling explicit scaffolded task setup and implementation. In the 3rd session, I'll be tackling engaged and explicit vocabulary instruction. And in my final session, we'll be examining structured, accountable academic discussion. I hope you found some valuable strategies and tips today, and as colleagues, I'll encourage you to get together, explore some of the resources on the Get Into the Act portal. I've included some very practical tools to you, from observation tools to planning guidelines on partners, with real strategic tips for you in addition to those I've provided on how you can get started as a faculty implementing structured partnering tomorrow. I'd encourage you to tackle this as your first step in structured student engagement, and then to move to examining what in this lesson that I'm embarking upon today, what will be the concrete physical and verbal responses that I need to carefully orchestrate to interrupt instruction. Thank you so much, and get out there and get into the act.
You've just seen Dr. Kate Kinsella discuss promoting engaged, accountable learning in the classroom. To find more information and additional resources on this and related topics, go to pubs.cde.ca.gov/TCS2.